Hi, Henry.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Not too bad, and yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. Of course, it's a little disorienting not to have Mickeyless here, who's normally my counterpart, but he's traveling, could not be reached for comment. And so you're going to have to do the things he normally does. That will involve annoying me a few times and expressing some reactionary views. Can you handle that?
I don't think so. I think I'm a bit of a lefty, so I'm going to try the opposite perspective, which is maybe to try and out-left you insofar as I can and maybe annoy you that way.
It's been done before. It's possible, I assure you. I don't know if I remember to tell people your last name. You're Henry Farrell from the Crooked Timber blog.
That's right. So it's a group blog which I've been participating in for about 3 years now. Mm-hmm. And I guess there are about 14 or 15 of us in there, mostly other academics.
Uh-huh. You hail originally from Ireland, but you've been in America long enough to be trusted with state secrets and so on?
Not necessarily trusted with state secrets, but I guess long enough that I've acquired a bit of an American twang, which my younger sisters give me a lot of grief about whenever I travel back across the Atlantic.
Do they really? Wasn't the first thing about your accent that struck me, I must say, but it's all relative, I guess.
Well, exactly. But if you're Irish, I sound hopelessly Americanized to you, so go figure.
Yeah, okay. Well, now Crooked Timber, by the way, is that an Isaiah Berlin quotation?
It is. It's a, how does it go again? From the
crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever something or other?
Yeah, no straight thing can ever be made, which I understand is a kind of a weak translation of the original German, but it makes for a good slogan, and so when we were casting around for a name for a slightly left-of-center group blog, we thought that this would be a good way of doing it.
But it's not a stereotypically kind of, I mean, it's a left-of-center blog, right? But that's not a stereotypically left-of-center quote. I mean, at least according to the way lefties are stereotyped by righties, they have a naive faith in the perfectibility of human nature, right?
Yeah, but I think this is a pretty useful fiction for righties to maintain, that leftists are a bunch of hopeless utopian idealists. But I don't think that's true, and I think one of the best books, one of my favorite books of the last few years, James Scott, Seeing Like a State, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed, which is a really nice take from the left on how all of these vast kinds of attempts to create some sort of a utopia have really failed, and why they have failed, given the kinds of crooked timber of humanity kinds of reasons that you might expect. So I think there's a real place for the left talking about this kind of stuff, and I guess a bunch of us occupy that position.
Okay. Well, I think I'm with you on your view of human nature.
Yeah.
If it's somewhat, at least mildly cynical. So we should talk about some current events. One thing that was in the papers today was that in Iraq, President Bush has been stressing that this is a sovereign government over there. Well, apparently he's not kidding. The Prime Minister basically told American troops to cut it out with all these checkpoints in Baghdad, and after a few hours of contemplating this idea, we complied. And apparently was not prearranged. We kind of came out of the blue.
Well, this is, I think, a pretty interesting story, because you would think, given the weakness of the Iraqi central administration and the fact that it doesn't have any real substantial military force of its own that isn't liable to defect at the first moment, you'd think that the Iraqis wouldn't be in a position where they could push the Americans around on this, as they very clearly, I think, have done. But I think that the reason why they've been successful in doing this is exactly because they're so weak. And here I think this is something that international relations scholars, Tom Jelling, I think is the person who first came up with this insight, have really harped on over the last 20 or 30 years. Sometimes if you want to get concessions from somebody, it actually helps to be weak, because that means that there are certain things that you just cannot be pushed into doing. And so I think what happened here pretty clearly is that the Americans looked at what this guy had said, weren't particularly happy with it, but decided that if they didn't comply with it, they'd be demonstrating that the Iraqi government was effectively an American pawn, which wasn't able to make orders about, to issue commands about basic issues of security, and that this would greatly damage the credibility of the Iraqi government, and effectively decided that the least worst thing that they could do was to comply. Obviously, that raises a lot of problems with people back home, with the idea that you never let one of your own troops go unaccounted for. But frankly, I don't think that the Americans had all that much choice given the strategic situation they're faced with.
No, and I mean, looking at it from the Iraqis' point of view, I mean, in Baghdad alone, I gather nearly 3,000 people are dying a month. So to them, the loss of one American soldier just doesn't seem worth crippling the city for, especially given the fact that, I mean, let's face it, you know, kidnapped is kind of a polite term almost for what happened to that soldier. I mean, this is, you know, he's basically probably already dead. So you can kind of understand how the Iraqis, I mean, apparently it was virtually paralyzing the city, this search for this one guy, and given that some of them have developed a pretty hostile attitude toward Americans already, you can imagine how it might not wear well. And I guess one of the useful things we can actually do for Maliki is sometimes serve as a kind of a unifying, well, enemy almost, from the point of view, you know, I mean, that's what we kind of functioned as in this case, right? I mean, it was in opposition to us that he gathered some domestic political strength, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess that's true, and it may well be that you can that the Americans, if they're savvy about this, actually can present themselves as being the in the future as being the guys who are effectively fold in order to demonstrate Maliki's strengths. Whether or not that's going to happen, I'd be very doubtful, because it may make broad strategic sense, but it's certainly not the kind of thing that can be sold very easily to the folks back home, or even to the armed forces out there, who clearly have a very strong bond of loyalty. You know, so there's a lot of mystique about you don't leave your own guys behind, and explaining that for reasons of realpolitik, this is what you've got to do, I think is going to be a non-starter. So
yeah, no, the ultimate purpose of going to these extraordinary lengths to find one missing soldier is to give soldiers the reassurance that, you know, we'll bail them out, and that's part of the psychology you need when you're going into a war. So it's an understandable kind of ritual, you know, on the part of the military. But I think you're right, in a certain sense. The weakness of the Iraqi government is the reason we really can't afford to push them around. I mean, I guess you mentioned Tom Schelling, the game theorist. I guess the famous example of his is a little relevant to this, of two guys playing chicken in cars. You know, they're driving toward each other, and the one in full view of the other tosses the steering wheel out of the window. So the other guy knows he cannot do anything but drive straight. And in effect, by having his own behavior constrained, he has become more powerful.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of those, and you know, everything I think comes from Schelling. I think 40 years later, we're still trying to work out the footnotes of that book, The Strategy of Conflict. It's one of the most brilliant books ever written, but I think that if you think of it in terms of these simple games such as Chicken, the Battle of the Sexes game, Prisoner's Dilemma, you can actually get a fair distance in actually understanding what's happening. I think there's another great example of that. I just read a piece Jim Fearon wrote this morning. It's a congressional testimony, which uses his game theoretic prowess and indeed his studies of civil wars to come to the conclusion that there's not all that much that the Americans can do to actually alleviate security in Iraq given the current setup. That effectively, when you have civil wars, both sides have an incentive to defect, and so this means that neither side is likely to trust the other. So unless you really manage to fundamentally transform the strategic situation through massive injections of troops or whatever, there's not all that much you can do except maybe bandage things up a little bit around the edges. You certainly can't do anything to tackle the major underlying issues that you're facing.
Yeah, well, we'll have to link to that. Now, elsewhere in the foreign scene, North Korea is coming back to the negotiating table, it says in today's papers. I guess they're agreeing again to the six-party talks. Is that it, or?
That's my understanding. Again, this seems to me to be kind of like kabuki politics. I don't get the impression from reading the papers, and I don't have much in the way of inside knowledge on this, I don't get the impression that anybody much believes that much is going to come out of this. The North Koreans are going to pretend to negotiate for a little while. The Chinese are going to pretend to believe them. The Americans are grudgingly going to go along on the chance that something can come out of this. But effectively, I think it's just the usual diplomatic game of staving off an inevitable disagreement which is going to be unpleasant for both sides.
Yeah, and I think I think there was a piece in the Christian Science Monitor somewhere saying more or less that from North Korea's point of view, this is a whole different set of talks. Now it has tested, with whatever degree of success, a nuclear device. It's a nuclear power, and now it sees itself as now being able to afford to have these talks because now it's a given that it's got the bomb. Now what do you want to talk about next?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. And there's also, North Korea is a weird blend of strengths and weakness because, again, I think a lot of the strengths of its negotiating position comes from the fact that it's so weak in a certain sense that nobody necessarily wants to see what would happen if the North Korean political system collapsed. Certainly not the Chinese, who would see millions of peasants probably fleeing across their borders. Probably not the South Koreans, for obvious reasons, to do with all of the poison gas, munitions, and other nasty stuff that the North Koreans likely have pointed at them. And now the bomb. It's a situation where nobody necessarily wants to pressure the regime to collapse. So I guess. Well,
I'm not sure that America would mind it so much. I mean, certainly of the relevant parties, America would be least disturbed, right?
Yeah, and I think that's been one of the sources of tension between Americans and South Koreans over the last while. And it's a little like what happened in Europe during the Cold War, where the Americans got kind of snippy when Germany started trying this Ostpolitik of trying to create relationships with East Germany and with the Warsaw Pact countries. And Americans basically said, this is crazy, these guys are never going to change. And the Germans said, well, you guys don't have to live with them right across the border, we've got to try something. And that's, I think, a fundamental problem. But I think even the Americans don't necessarily want to see what would happen if North Korea did collapse, because there's a lot of tricky, unresolved issues in that region, and these could suddenly get infinitely more complicated. So
they could, although there's also a pretty good chance that when the dust settled, you would wind up with a regime more amenable to discussion with the rest of the world, right? It could hardly be less so. I mean, I admit that there's some it might be hard to have a graceful transition. I mean, I think what would be nice is to more or less have China help engineer a coup, right?
Yeah, I think so, and that may be a little bit more in China's interest. As I say, I'm not a specialist in this area, so what I know is what I read.
You're closer to it than I am, though.
Yeah. What I know is what I read in the newspapers, or maybe in foreign affairs or whatever. But clearly China's patience is beginning to wear thin. But again, the options on the table are not very attractive, and I think that the Bush administration, I think, has messed this up, and that it's vacillated for the last several years between a belligerent posture and between a sort of a more open to negotiations posture, and hasn't decided which one it would go with. But that said, I'm not sure if it had decided to go, say, with the more open to negotiations posture, it might have succeeded, but I think the chances would still have been pretty small, because there's not all that much pressure it can really put upon the North Koreans. It can certainly make it more difficult for them to engage in external financial transactions, and maybe the regime is having difficulty importing some of those little luxuries that make life pleasant for the top party cadres, but that's not necessarily going to be enough to make it execute a major U-turn in strategic policy. So
yeah, I mean, China and South Korea could together put a pretty much lethal amount of pressure on the regime through cutting off trade and so on, I guess. But your point is that the North Korean regime is so volatile. I mean, North Korea is so volatile, and this kind of weakness on the part of the regime is its strength.
Yeah, exactly. So then you've got to think about it. Again, Thomas Schelling, is this a credible threat that the North Koreans and the Chinese will be making? And what if North Korea called their bluff? Again, there would be neither the Chinese nor the South Koreans would necessarily be very happy with a situation in which there was unrest, in which there were possibly weapons, especially being pointed in the direction of Seoul, and millions of starving peasants, and the very best case scenario, having to go in there and effectively having to remake a country that's been held back for the last 40 years, with an incredibly retrograde society, with all of the problems that entails.
So you think it's now, we just basically more or less have to accept that North Korea is a nuclear power? It's,
again, from what you read, it sounds like the test was a bit of a fizzle. The megatonnage, as far as I understand, and maybe there's more information which is emerging on this in the recent past, the megatonnage would seem to suggest that at best this was a partial success. But even so, a partial success is enough to generate real strategic uncertainty. Because really from the point of view of North Korea, it doesn't necessarily want to use the bomb, assuming that there's some degree of rationality there. It just wants to have the credible threat of being able to use the bomb. And while the threat isn't quite as credible as if there had been a completely successful test, it still means that it's going to be it still means that the amount of external pressure which can be exerted on North Korea is perhaps considerably less than it might have been had they not taken the step.
Yeah. Now, what worries me most about North Korea having the bomb is the possibility that it could sell it to some non-state actor, which leads us to this. I'm holding up this cover of the New York Times Magazine, this piece, Islam and the Bomb, by Noah Feldman, which we both agreed we would read.
Yep.
But which we haven't discussed yet. Well, what's your take on the piece?
My take on the piece is, first of all, just a quick thing on North Korean proliferation. There's a really smart PhD candidate out this year who's written a very nice thing on the incentives for countries like North Korea to proliferate. And basically, what the argument he makes is they have a strong incentive under certain circumstances to proliferate because this helps weaken alternative powers such as the United States in comparison. But on the piece in the New York Times, I thought it was a pretty bad piece, to be perfectly frank. It read like I guess the guy is a law professor, and this read to me like a lawyer who's making an argument that's pretty weak on the issues.
Yeah, by the way, he's no ordinary law professor. He was the Bush administration's man in Iraq when it came to constitution writing. He was sent over right after the invasion, I think, to oversee or I don't know if he was like in charge, but he was a principal guy in the authoring of the Iraqi Constitution. I don't know if it's the one they wound up with, but at one point he was going to be a big guy in that regard.
That's interesting, and Matt Iglesias had a piece responding to this, where he effectively raises the question: is this some sort of trial balloon for the administration's policy, maybe a March invasion or a March attack on Iraq or something, or on Iran or something like that? And I guess to the extent that this guy has strong administration ties, the possibility of that is raised at least somewhat, and that presumably there are people within the administration who are not only talking about this but are prepared to go public to some extent. But I thought it was a pretty bad piece. It didn't so much argue as it insinuated, and it just didn't. I got the impression that he was somebody who's trying to argue his way towards, we must do something about this before it gets too late. The threat of an Islamic bomb is a dreadful threat. But he doesn't present any very good arguments within his piece for why it is a threat of that sort.
Well, it seemed to me, I mean, if we're going to continue in this vein of being cynical about the author, it struck me as an attempt to look moderate and reasonable, while fundamentally, at least implicitly, advocating, arguing that stopping Iran from getting the bomb is completely imperative. He doesn't ever say that, but then suddenly, toward the very end, this sentence shows, I mean, he's kind of moving in that direction, and then suddenly this sentence shows up where he says, whether forced negotiation or some combination is the right path to take to keep Iran from going nuclear is, of course, a hugely important question. And you're like, wait a second. Have we even established that we do have to keep Iran from going nuclear? And I should say, I would very much prefer to keep Iran from going nuclear, but he kind of slides obliquely into the position of having established that it's absolutely imperative that we stop them, and it's only a question of how. But A, he hasn't actually said that explicitly, and B, the argument he's made, to the extent that it's an argument, has certainly not established that it's imperative to America's national security.
Well, it's a pretty bizarre article because, as you say, there are a lot of non sequiturs in there. So he argues one thing and it kind of seems to lead down one direction, and then he comes in with another sentence, which claims to be following on from what he's just said, but in fact which bears little resemblance. There's a the bit which struck me a bit like the piece that you wrote, although I don't think it's as important to his overall argument, he starts by talking about the classical Islamic principles governing war and how the traditional ban on killing women, children, and fellow Muslims has been weakened over time. And then he says, quote, "This means that a nuclear Islamic state would be at least as willing to use its weapons as a comparable non-Islamic state." Unquote.
Right.
He hasn't proved anything of the sort. He said, well, it used to be that Islamic states had some strong protections against these things. They've weakened those protections over time. And this somehow proves that nuclear Islamic states are more dangerous than non-Islamic states.
Well, wait, but he doesn't even say that. I mean, what I was going to say is, so what if he had proved that? Can you read that sentence? Isn't he in that sentence just saying, so an Islamic state is as dangerous as a non-Islamic state?
It's at least as dangerous.
Right. Well, I mean, so what? I mean, of course, we assume they're at least that dangerous. I mean, according to stereotypes, that's a given. And yet, that is all he's established at that point. It's a very funny piece because he starts out as if suicide bombing is the big question, right? I mean, early on in the piece, he's saying, traditionally, nuclear powers are kept from striking through deterrence, but that depends on the idea that they don't want to die, right? Because that's how deterrence works. There would be nuclear retaliation. So this is a grave issue that we must address. And first of all, I'm thinking right away, like, I'm sorry, but I don't quite get the connection. If you're there are two kinds of Islamic threats with a bomb. There's an Islamic State. And in my view, one thing all state leaders have in common, Islamic and non-Islamic, is that they don't want to die, right? I mean, politicians are very good at getting other people to go out and die for them, and sometimes the people they get to die for them are suicide bombers. But politicians, especially in authoritarian states, are above all survivors, national leaders. So I don't, and in any event, he certainly doesn't argue that I'm kind of wrong in that. Then the other question is, okay, suppose it's a terrorist group who's using it. Well, if it's a terrorist group, the whole reason it's scary for any terrorist group to have a nuclear bomb is that we don't have a return address for them. So they don't have to be committing suicide to use it. I mean, if we could kill bin Laden, we'd kill him now. We don't know where he is, and the same would be true, after a nuclear bomb. And so so he slides. He kind of doesn't deny any of that, and slowly that issue. He kind of almost concedes, okay, that's not the issue. He basically concedes a series of things are actually not the issue. The only issue in the end is that Iran is an enemy of America's, which is true at this point, and enemies can use a nuclear, and he says, and I'll grant you that maybe they wouldn't strike America or Israel or anything, but enemies can use nuclear weapons to behave more assertively in the geopolitical environment. That's true too. But that's not quite establishing that it's vital to stop them from having a bomb at all costs. I mean, Russia and China were our enemies for a long time and had the nuclear bomb, and we're alive to tell about it. So,
well, it's worse, and unfortunately, I think we're agreeing too much here.
Yeah, it may be boring, but I'm telling you, this is really a shabby piece of writing.
It's really awful, and I think that the basic case that you're making, insofar as he does make a case, an outright overt case, that's the case that he's making. But
I think quite explicitly he would say, in the end, that's his argument, that Iran's the enemy, and then he tries to say, but that is related to historically to Iran's being Islamic. Well, yeah, it's also related to the fact that we did this coup in 1953 that deposed a democratically elected government and installed a brutal tyrant. Yeah, that, and that in turn helped fuel the subsequent Islamic fundamentalism. But so he has this kind of vague connection between their enmity toward us and Islamic radicalism. And there is a connection there, but ultimately his argument comes down to the fact that they are an enemy.
Well, when I look at this piece, I don't think it's worth analysing as an argument. I think it's worth analysing as a piece of, to be blunt about it, political propaganda. Because, so why does he go through several thousand words talking about Islam and suicide bombing, Islam and this, that, and the other, when it's not actually relevant to his main point? And I think
it's bizarre. I mean, it's not. I should say it's bizarre. I mean, it's not bizarre.
It's very understandable. And what he's doing, I think, is he's trying to establish a case not by argument, but by innuendo. So all of this stuff about suicide bombing is kind of insinuating its way towards saying, well, we can't really show that Islamists are more likely to basically blow up their civilization in order to get at us, but we must at least raise the possibility. And that in itself, I think, is a rhetorical move. And so he has this crazy argument, which is actually that, well, if we look at the way that the Iranians sent out hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths in the Iran-Iraq war, hundreds of young people, this could be taken as showing some sort of a greater attachment to basically expending the lives of your people. You could make exactly the same argument about Christianity in the First World War and hundreds of thousands of people dying in the trenches. It's a bizarre argument. Final thing that I see in this piece, the history that it presents of hostility towards America, again, is a bizarre history, because it basically, what it says is, the root of all anti-Americanism in the region is Iranian propaganda of one sort or another. He more or less explicitly says that at the end. And this is just, I think, a nonsensical and highly biased reading of history. Clearly, the fact that Iran has been an enemy for a long time of the United States feeds into hostility in the region. But equally clearly, there's a whole bunch of other things going on there. And I think that this can... I really think that this has to be read as some kind of a way of basically trying to insinuate your way towards a case for war.
No, I thought it was extremely disingenuous. I mean, in the end, it's not a mystery why he spins so much, why he wants to start out that way, about, kind of suicide bomb, start out with kind of the scare headlines that he himself, in essence, debunks, right?
Yeah.
Because the rhetorical purpose of that is for him to become this reasonable person you trust. So he goes through and, no, he's not, he doesn't suffer from these anti-Islamic stereotypes. He doesn't think suicide bombing ultimately is really the issue. He doesn't think this is ultimately really the issue. By the end of the piece, he's seeming like this reasonable guy with no particular axe to grind, and then all of a sudden he slides into this conclusion without quite stating it, that at all costs, we have to do whatever it takes, including invasion, to stop Iran from getting the bomb. And I think, with a lot of readers, maybe that rhetorical setup will work. I think that's the function of it from his point of view. And, in defense of the New York Times Magazine, I would say, I was for 7 months the acting editor of a weekly magazine, and I want to tell you, A, that was no picnic. Trying to come up with something interesting for the cover every week, and B, if you had said to me, hey, next week I can get you a cover story that will say Islam and the bomb, and the piece will have at least some remote connection to that, I'd go, sign me up, That's this week's issue. But I wish I had a conservative to kind of argue with about this, because it may seem too easy that we're agreeing, but at least it wasn't prearranged. We both just read it separately, and we actually don't even know each other. This is the first extended discussion you and I have ever had, but we came to the same conclusion, for whatever that's worth. I guess it means we're both lefties.
I guess it does mean, but I also think that there are a bunch of smart conservatives beginning to come out of the woodwork who are, I would suspect, equally appalled with the kind of stuff that's happening here. People like, I think, Belgravia Dispatch, Greg Jajarian, who clearly comes from an old-style realist point of view, and who clearly is pretty horrified at a bunch of the ways in which the administration and its allies have effectively abused rhetoric in order to make the case for war.
Yeah, so, that's a good blog and a good example of a conservative who, I find myself agreeing with, 70-80% of the time, just because we share, an abhorrence about the Bush administration's foreign policy.
Yeah, and I think that one of the worst things that's happened over the last 5 or 6 years has been a degradation of the public discourse. And in fairness, this is not only about the Bush administration, it's happened on the left as well as on the right, with a kind of a gung-ho jingoism substituting for thought among a whole bunch of people. And if you try to analyze things in a slightly more nuanced way, you're basically attacked as being anti-patriotic, as wanting the US to lose, and all of those horrible things. And
especially if you have a foreign accent, I'll bet.
Especially if you've got a foreign accent. I mean, I guess Irish people, so we're kind of cute. We're leprechauns at the end of the rainbow, so we can get away with a lot of stuff. But clearly, if I was French, it would be a whole different.
Yeah. At least it's not French. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this has led to some real problems. Mark Lynch, who has another great blog, who's a lefty, Abu Aardvark, covering Middle East issues, started off a group blog of Middle East specialists, and the founding statement was basically something along the lines of, well, if we look at American public discourse, there are a bunch of people who are talking about the Middle East who frankly don't know all that much about what's happening there, and who are mapping, he didn't quite say this, but this is the implication I think, who are mapping their own beliefs and their own domestic politics and a pretty flawed view of the world onto what we ought to be doing, and we need to start figuring out ways of trying to improve the quality of debate so that even if there are real issues about what to do with regard to Iran, but that they be debated in a serious way and not in a way where you effectively get pieces like this, which I think are baldly pieces of propaganda being published at great lengths in the New York Times Magazine.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. What else to say about the piece? It just kind of became annoying at the end that he had spent so much time on what turned out to finally not be the issue, and does have a rhetorical purpose, but kind of frustrating.
Yeah.
So maybe if we keep trudging through world affairs, we can find something to disagree on. We're at least about to move to an issue on which I disagree with a lot of leftists. I fear you may not be one of them, but it has to do with kind of China and information technology. I mean, as it happens, a story in today's paper is that in a rare event in China, a case was overturned. It had been the conviction of a human rights advocate in China who had represented some peasants, some of whom I think had been forcibly sterilized and or had coercive abortions or both as a result of the one-child policy. And they noted how unusual it was for a case like this, for a conviction like this to be overturned. My own feeling is that information technology in China has tended to decentralize power in China, moved power into the grassroots, and right now you're seeing it in the form of like riots and protests and things, and not so much in the form of actual reform of laws as you would like to see eventually. But I think if China stays together and doesn't kind of fall apart or something, I think that's where this kind of raw form of pluralism is probably headed. You may actually agree, but certainly a lot of people on the left get very annoyed if you tell them that you think that the information technology that capitalism has brought to China is going to be ultimately a good thing.
Well, I think I disagree, but only on the nuances, which is to say, I think that the basic case you lay out there is exactly the right case, which is 5 or 6 years ago, or 7 or 8 years ago, we got a lot of optimism about how the internet was going to change everything. Bill Clinton talking about how trying to control the internet was like trying to nail Jello to the wall, and similar kinds of rhetoric on the right. And it's pretty clear that these kinds of simple predictions that say the internet was going to aid democracy activists at the expense of evil authoritarian governments everywhere haven't come to pass. And what we have gotten to see is, I think, what you identified there, which is that there's been a certain decentralization of power and the building up of a kind of civil society which isn't as directly under the control of the government. Where I disagree is that I'm a little more skeptical about where this is going. There's a positive take and a negative take. The positive take is the take that you provide, and I think the take that Rebecca McKinnon, who I think is really the smartest person writing about this, that she takes, which is, well, over the longer run, this is likely to lead to a positive civil society, which at the very least is going to be a countervailing power to the government, and may lead in the direction of greater civil rights and freedom over the longer term. The negative way to look at it is to take a look at the riots, the anti-Japan riots that we saw happening some months back, which clearly were spurred in some ways by bulletin boards and by text messaging and things like that, and to say, well, the weakening of government power in China may not necessarily lead to the strengthening of pro-civil society, fuzzy, cuddly kinds of things. It may lead to increased nationalism, rushing in to fill the void. It may lead to a lot of unpleasant consequences.
Yeah, but that's true of democracy itself, right? I mean, when people are free, they sometimes get together and do things we don't approve of.
Well, I'm not a China specialist, so take this with a ton of salt. But here's one possible reading of what's happening. it's pretty clear that the Chinese government, when it tries to crack down on this stuff, its main target is to make sure that no group arises which is capable of challenging the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on power. So it goes after Falun Gong, which is a slightly crazy religious group in my opinion, but it goes after them because they appear to have a national presence and because they might one day become the nucleus of a significant counterforce. Chinese government seems to be pretty good at doing that. What it doesn't seem to be good at is in controlling the kinds of spontaneous things that we saw happening with regard to Japan. And so we might end up in a worst of both worlds kind of situations, where the Chinese government is powerful enough to prevent any alternative organizing force from arising in society, but not powerful enough to keep the lid on the pressure cooker over the longer term, so that effectively we get a return to chaos, a return to warlordism, a return perhaps to extreme and pretty ugly nationalism. Now, as I say, I am not an expert. This is something which it may well be that there's good evidence that I'm boldly wrong upon, but that's one possible negative scenario that you could spin out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, first of all, I'd add a little nuance to my own view and say that my view's never been that the information technology was going to be kind of inevitably liberating or inevitably lead to any kind of pluralism. I mean, if a regime chooses to keep it just out of the country, like North Korea has done, you may be able to succeed at that for a while. It's just that the price you will pay is an increasing decline in your economic status relative to the rest of the world. China seems to have opted for prosperity as the model. That's why they've embraced all this technology. And I think if you do that, it does tend to be decentralizing. And I think in the long run, probably there are three scenarios that are the main options if they continue to embrace the information technology. One is kind of like what we'd like to see, movement toward something much closer to a democracy. Another thing is a one-party, somewhat authoritarian system that does an incredibly good job of actually keeping people happy. The way Singapore's authoritarians have stayed in power largely by just, keeping people in pretty good shape, actually. There aren't a lot of people in Singapore who are starving or have other major grievances. That can happen. But that would be, something I think I could kind of live with. If the Chinese are happy with their government, I could live with that. The other thing is one form of chaos or another, some of which I think you've kind of identified. I'm not at all sure that the Chinese transformation can stay on track, and there is the danger of it going off the rails in various ways. But a lot of the source of the danger is, I think, a rapid decentralization of power, and I think the challenge is to keep the decentralization of power from having those kinds of unfortunate effects.
Well, one argument which I think Shanti Calisale made in Foreign Affairs a few years back is that information technology can help a little bit with some aspects of the decentralization of power with regard, for example, to regional autonomy of the various local party barons and whatever, in that it helps to provide some sort of checks or alternative means of information gathering which allow the central committee to make sure that the guys out in the provinces aren't behaving too badly. So that's one possible positive countervailing element, at least if you're interested in stability more than, and maybe an evolution towards a Singapore-type solution more than you are in the evolution of freedom and chaos and excitement and all of those things.
Yeah. The last thing I'd say is that people who, when I trot out this argument, that on balance the information technology seems to me to be doing good over there, and if things stay on track will probably do more good. The people who just scoff at that tend to be people who are so young that they don't remember the Cold War. China was so opaque to information in those days,
Yeah.
Now, China is massively more transparent to us than it was during the Cold War. And the rest of the world, the outside world, is more visible to the Chinese than it was. And all these things we're starting to take for granted, but it's a radical contrast with the situation during the Cold War. And I would say what you've seen is a transformation from a truly totalitarian government with a communist, economic philosophy to an authoritarian government with a quasi-capitalist economic philosophy, and that's, to me, progress, moving from totalitarianism to authoritarianism. And I mean, not to embrace a famous neocon dichotomy or anything, but I actually think it's kind of valid in this case. And so I continue to argue that we're moving in the right direction.
Well, fingers crossed. One other thing which McKinnon argues is that the current U.S. policy may actually be a bad thing, which is to say that...
I'm sorry, which policy?
Current U.S. policy, for example, the talk about sanctioning Google and talk about giving tools to pro-democracy activists may be a bad thing, because if you're interested in building up civil society over the longer term, the last thing you want to do is to create an obvious opposition between government and forces in civil society, because that's liable to lead to more of a crackdown, and you want this thing to build up around the edges without government paying too much attention. Now,
so are these like National Endowment for Democracy type policies?
So effectively the argument there would be that the U.S. should not be engaged in setting up, for example, punishing U.S. companies for acceding to the Chinese government. It should not be seeking to empower democracy activists directly. Instead, it just should be pursuing a policy of benign, fairly passive support for this, and not getting too heavily involved in directly supporting democracy activists. Now,
and the support consisting largely in economic engagement, I take it.
That is the argument that is being made. Basically that you don't get too confrontational over these issues. The confrontation is liable to lead to problems rather than to lead to progress. Now, that, as I say, I'm not a China expert. That may or may not be right. There are certainly arguments going the other way, but it's certainly something which will be out there.
Yeah, well, I certainly think overwhelmingly the strongest lever we have is economic. I mean, the best thing we can do is keep channels of economic engagement open. And I'm not familiar enough with the specific programs by which we try to fiddle with the politics to know what I would say, but I might well be amenable to that argument if I knew what I was talking about.
One other final thing which is kind of interesting is the way in which China is kind of helping to prop up some pretty nasty regimes around the world. So to the extent that China is now beginning to get interested in the race for resources and the race for oil and whatever, it's now engaging directly with a lot of pretty unsavory regimes in various parts of Asia and Africa, and effectively helping to insulate them from pressure from Western human rights types by providing them with alternative markets where people don't care very much about whether these guys are good guys or bad guys in terms of human rights protection.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question why China feels compelled to lock up all these energy contracts. I mean, one interpretation is that is so that they will be able to do various things we won't like without fear of sanction. I mean, whether it's throw around their power regionally or mistreat their people. That's one theory. The other theory is a more kind of free-floating anxiety about Western intervention. And I guess there are aspects of the energy market that maybe make it in your interest to nail things down in the longer run than with some other markets. I mean, it's not a purely efficient kind of market for various reasons, I guess. But I've always been a little puzzled about. I mean, do you have an answer to that, or?
I don't. Again, it's not my area. I read people like Daniel Jorgen, and pretty clearly it's not a transparent market, and there's a lot of political control and issues of political control that go along with that. And Europe, the European Union, is facing a lot of the same problems with regard to Russia, and decisions being made over pipelines, and decisions over the extent to which Russian firms should be allowed to participate in the European economy, when these Russian firms seem very often to be arms of the Russian government. So there's a very messy set of new political relationships emerging, which I think we're neglecting to some extent because of the catastrophe that we're seeing in the Middle East. And these things are perhaps in the long term going to be even more important in shaping the world that our children and our grandchildren inhabit.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, if you could somehow just guarantee and convince the world that energy markets would operate in an above-board kind of legitimate, kind of Econ 101 perfect market way where, you could probably do a lot to relax international tensions. I mean, because a number of powers that we worry about, I mean, we've just mentioned Russia and China, kind of operate on the assumption that that's not going to be the case, and the things they do to secure the energy are things we don't like, and are things that are not good often.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you would do that. I still don't get the way the oil markets work, and the way, I mean, for example, people say, well, Venezuela, has leverage over the U.S. because it's got so much oil. And, well, yeah, but, I mean, if it didn't sell us the oil, it would have to sell it to somebody, so the oil prices wouldn't change much globally, and we could buy it from somebody else. Of course, it's a little cheaper to get it from somebody who's near you because it costs less to transport it. But still, I think there's clearly something about energy markets I don't understand.
Unfortunately, I'm the same. I mean, clearly, on the one hand, there are strong aspects of a perfectly competitive market there in terms of oil spot prices and whatever. But also, my guess, and this is just a guess, is a lot of it has to do with the long-term infrastructural decisions that are being made, especially with regard to things like gas and gas pipelines, which clearly have a pretty substantial geostrategic aspect to them, and where the US indeed has been engaged in Central Asia and elsewhere in trying to make sure that the gas pipelines flow in one direction and don't flow in another, and with particular reference to our old friend Iran here.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a big part of it, is that the infrastructure is, it's a lot of capital investment and time involved in getting an infrastructure for transporting this stuff over land in some cases.
Yeah.
So if somebody's going to have the capacity to cut off your supply in that regard, you've got to make arrangements for that. But okay, so well, now we're going to move into something that you do profess to know something about, because you wrote a whole article about it in the Boston Review, which is a very good journal. And it was this piece on the netroots.
Yeah, and let me plug the Boston Review again. I think it's one of the best journals out there. And
yes, and its editor is the esteemed Josh Cohen.
Exactly. So should I give a quick version? My argument, I guess, was twofold. First of all, I was trying to take on a bunch of the people who a few months ago were arguing that the advent of bloggers to politics was effectively leading to a breakdown of civility and perhaps the breakdown of Western civilization. There was one particularly ludicrous article by Morton Kondrake, I think, in Roll Call, which made that case. And to show that in some ways, if you look at the kinds of things that bloggers do, it's pretty vigorous, it's pretty much no pulse punched, or no punches pulled kind of debate. But nonetheless, it's the kind of thing that if you want a democratically engaged public, it's the kind of thing that you would expect to happen. And secondly, to try and evaluate the circumstances under which bloggers do or do not make a difference to politics. And here my argument was with regards to the Lieberman race, that they didn't actually make much of a difference on the ground to Ned Lamont's campaign, but what they did do was to draw national attention to it and to change the way, to some extent, in which the race was perceived by national elites.
Okay. Now, there's one... I have a couple of questions about seeming ironies here. One is, I agree. I mean, these, whenever you radically lower the cost of processing or distributing information, you would expect for power to be decentralized. I mean, you could argue that the printing press did the same thing. But there has been, in the wake of the decentralization of influence represented by the blogosphere, hasn't there been a kind of reconsolidation, which is to say, in fairly short order, a fairly small number of blogs became dominant in terms of the amount of traffic, right?
Yeah, and you could map that out. I don't talk about it that much in the paper. Dan Bresner and I have talked about that in a previous article. And I think that you are seeing hierarchies being established, but I think that by necessity they're somewhat weaker hierarchies than the hierarchies that replace them. So say, for example, take the New Republic. You're Marty Peretz, you set up the New Republic, you buy it, and you then have hiring and firing authority over everybody who effectively writes for that paper, and you have a privileged position because of that. If you're a prominent blogger on the left or on the right, if you're Glenn Reynolds or Marcos Zuniga or whoever, you have a lot of power, but it's less a power to hire and fire. It's less a power to dictate what the debate is going to be. It's a power to draw attention to some parts of the debate and perhaps to some extent to draw attention away from other parts of the debate. So there are real hierarchical forces, but I think that the hierarchy is weaker in the blogosphere than it is in traditional magazine publishing. Or indeed in newspapers like you look at newspapers in the US, and it's the New York Times, it's the Post, it's a couple of newspapers on the West Coast, the Boston Globe, if you want to push it, and that's about it. You don't get all that much in the way of serious local newspapers actually having all that much clout. And I think in the blogosphere, mid-level bloggers have a lot more clout than, say, mid-level regional newspapers have in the national debate.
Yeah, and is there also, there must be some significance, I've never thought of this before now, but to the fact that blogs, to maintain their stature, are dependent on the continued goodwill of other blogs, and this happens through reciprocal linkage. I mean, Instapundit is a very prolific linker. That's part of the key to his formula for success. I mean, the fact that he uses short items has two great properties. One is it's updated frequently enough so that the blog becomes addictive. The other is that if in every one of those short items there's a link to some other blog, he's recurring a reciprocal obligation. And this is a big part of his formula, in addition to the fact that, he's a smart guy and everything. But it seems to me that, just thinking about it for the first time, that's really different from the situation of a magazine owner, editor like Marty Peretz, right? I mean, he's not... it seems to me like in that sense, Marty would be more autonomous and less dependent on continued alliance with other similar entities. Does that make any sense?
That makes a lot of sense, yes, because I think the biggest locus of power, I think, in the blogosphere, certainly on the left, is Marcus Zuniga's blog. But if Marcus Zuniga deviates too much from the kinds of preferences of the other readers, of the bloggers who make up his community, he's going to get chastened in pretty short order. And we saw a little bit of this happen at the yearly COS meeting, when Mark Warner threw a very expensive party, which COS and a couple of other bloggers thought was okay, but which provoked a lot of disgruntlement among other bloggers. So, there are community ties there, which I think, at least to some extent, limit the leaders of the community. And the second thing that I think goes along with that is that the whole behavior of linking through to other bloggers leads to a very different rationale about how information or interesting opinions are gathered than traditional news. Take the New York Times. If the Boston Globe or the Washington Post reports a story, manages to break a story, the New York Times is less likely to link to that story or to report on that story unless it can find its own angle, because it feels that it's been scooped. That doesn't happen with bloggers. If Josh Marshall finds some blogger, some otherwise unknown blogger who's got some really tasty scoop on something, Josh Marshall links to that blogger and grabs the scoop and circulates it more widely. And so the upside of that, I think, is that information and interesting opinions get circulated a lot more rapidly, a lot more efficiently. The downside is that you can also get rumors and crazy ideas circulating pretty rapidly and pretty efficiently, and certain kinds of groupthink beginning to set in. But that's a problem, I think, that every form of media has to a greater or lesser extent.
And I mean, I not to overdo the point I just made, I mean, certainly magazine owners have always been dependent on the continued goodwill of various parties. I mean, I guess they want to see the name of the magazine mentioned approvingly in some other publications and so on. So, there's always been linkage of a kind, right? But if nothing else, this is a whole lot faster.
Absolutely, and more fun. I mean, it's easier. Where I think the blogosphere, the kinds of blogs I really like, I like the way that you can get experts blogging on a topic in a way that mainstream journalists just can't match. If you wanted to read about Specter's legislation a couple of months back, you didn't go to the New York Times. You went to Jack Balkin's blog Balkanization, where he and Marty Letterman, both two pretty interesting law professors, dissected the legislation bit by bit and gave you very clear insights as to what was happening, at a level of detail that I don't think a conventional reporter could actually match. So you've got a whole bunch of access to new resources and new kinds of ways of dealing with original source material that I think just wasn't possible before the blogosphere was around. Yeah,
it's almost amazing that America has been as politically stable as it's been given how rapid this change has been, in my view, in the distribution of this kind of power. I don't know. I guess we're pretty adaptable, or so. I mean, and you could say the same about a lot of other countries, but it seems to me an intrinsically disruptive thing that hasn't been, all that, hasn't been violently disruptive so far. Although I think in other countries, that we're kind of on the verge. I think you could argue that information technology and its decentralizing power was involved in pushing them, say the Ukrainian Revolution and so on. But still, it's an amazing time, and I think we're not halfway through it. I kind of had a question about the other irony in reading your Boston Review piece that struck me is just that in talking about the netroots specifically, two things came out. I mean, one, on the one hand, you said that they're very much about winning. They want the left to win again, and to that extent, they're not as wed to ideology in some ways as some other groups. And in particular, you said that they don't want the Democratic Party to be overly constrained by interest groups. And yet, they are extremely antagonistic toward the Democratic Leadership Council type moderates who I think would fit roughly that same description, right? They don't want the Democratic Party tied down by special interests. They would favor pragmatism over ideology in some respects, right?
Yeah, well, I think, and that it sort of comes out in the Boston Review piece, but it doesn't come out as clearly as maybe it should have. I think that the netroots are more ideological than they actually think that they are, and that they're perhaps more ideological, they're going to become more ideological over time. And here what I think is, a lot of the netroots' ambition is born not only out of the desire to have a Democratic Party which wins again, but out of a disgust with a certain kind of centrist version of bipartisanship, which they perceive as being undue deference to the Republican way of doing things. And I think this is the reason why Joe Lieberman in particular became a hate figure, because he was perceived as being somebody who basically played the bipartisanship thing up in order to mug to the Sunday talk show hosts, and in so doing effectively damage the interests of their party. And I think over the longer term, the netroots are beginning to figure out that if they really want to change where the centre is, that they're going to actually have to become more ideological, not necessarily in a strongly left-wing kind of way, but certainly to view the kinds of things that they can or cannot do as basically being trying to unseat a certain kind of dominant ideology and reseat another one in its place. And that's my best guess as to where the netroots are going to be going over the next couple of years.
And of course, Lieberman leads us to what may soon become clearly an irony, and I guess this is our chance to talk a little about the election. I mean, if at this point we didn't dwell slightly on the election, we would be the only two people conversing about politics in America who don't. I mean, the irony is, it looks like, in a way, the first unequivocal electoral triumph of the netroots was to beat Joe Lieberman in the primaries, and now, I gather, last time I looked, it looked like he was probably going to win in the general as an independent, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here I think this is a story which has been misconstrued a couple of different ways, which is, I think that this debate, and I tried to talk about this a little bit in the piece, originally I don't think that the netroots actually thought that they had much hope of making Joe Lieberman lose the Democratic nomination. If you read, for example, MyDD and the Daily Kos before the key convention, where it becomes clear that Lieberman doesn't have as much support among the Democratic powers in Connecticut as he might like to, it's pretty clear that they're trying to lower expectations as much as possible, that they don't think that their guy is going to win. They're doing this more, I think, to damage somebody that they dislike. Then when he wins a thing, they get super excited, they go a little crazy, they think, well, they can maybe bring this the full way. But in the end of the day, I don't think that the success of Lamont against Lieberman in electoral terms was a story of bloggers. I don't think that the failure of Lamont's campaign in the fall election to catch fire is a story about bloggers. In both cases, I think this is a story where bloggers help to frame things for the national debate. But I think that one of the key things I talk about is how Coase effectively describes this election ad that he's involved in, which I think was perceived by a bunch of people as being representative of how it was that the bloggers were taking over. You have Lamont delivering a boring campaign speech, and suddenly Coase, with a bunch of raggle-taggle volunteers in T-shirts, comes in and disrupts the whole damn thing. But if you talk to Coase, he says, well, of the people who are involved in that, of the 20-odd, maybe 2 of them actually even knew what a blog was. And so I think that the Lieberman story was basically a traditional story of a guy who had lost touch with his local powers, or with his local people. Local activists hated him, and also I think local party bosses were disgruntled because Lieberman hadn't been doing the rubber chicken circuit, hadn't been, so basically kowtowing to them in the way that they felt that they were owed. And this caused a lot of problems for him, clearly, in the Democratic Party, which the Lamont campaign was able to capitalize upon. And then the Lamont campaign, I think, goes a little pear-shaped for a variety of reasons. A bunch of the bloggers are blaming the Democratic Party honchos. I think there's some truth to that, but I think that there's also a lot of truth to just Lamont not having been a very successful or effective politician in taking advantage of whatever momentum he had immediately afterwards and turning that momentum into something that could become a lead. So I think that the bottom line story is, I think, you can't get too obsessed with the bloggers. When you look at actual electoral outcomes, they may swing things a percentage point or 2 one way or the other way. Where they are important, I think, is in framing more national level political debates and in more indirect ways in influencing politics, not in directly getting people out on the ground to vote one way or the other way.
Yeah. And I think, you said earlier that one of the gripes with Lieberman was that, for kind of Sunday talk show purposes, he would get into this deeply bipartisan mode. But there's also the fact that on foreign policy, he is genuinely to the right.
Yeah.
And he happened to hit a stretch where foreign policy was suddenly, a big issue. So I can't say I was especially sorry to see him bite the dust in that primary, but his resurrection is something I'm not especially pleased about. But that's life. We're slightly over an hour, and that's about as long as anyone ever goes on Blogging Heads. This has been a lot of fun, Henry. Final proof that you're not Mickey Kaus is that during the entire hour, I did not once roll my eyes at the absurdity of anything you said.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to do better next time. I'll try to come up with 6 impossible things to proclaim, and maybe we'll get a better
If you could do that, if you could work on that in the meanwhile, it would certainly be a more familiar viewing environment for our viewers. But I actually enjoyed the amount of agreement we had. I don't know whether it makes for captivating viewing, but it's good for my life expectancy, I think, if I'm not always rolling my eyes. In any event, you got to come back. This was good. The investment in your webcam was a wise one, I think.
Well, it was a whole lot of fun for me as well. So thank you so much for bringing me along for this.
My pleasure. We'll see you again.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.